video will cover all aspects of priming and conditioning from the basic level to advanced competition level priming and conditioning of your beer. Since this is a huge topic, this video has been made into several parts as I found that there is a great deal of literature written on the same. I will be mostly talking about priming with corn sugar only, as it is the most commonly used, but at the same time I'll be touching upon other sugars as well for completion's sake. Advanced priming methods like using honey, crossening and using yeast and wort to prime will be dealt in another video due to the large amount of information involved. Carbonation with sugar is called natural carbonation, whereas using a CO2 cylinder to carbonate your beer is called artificial carbonation. The carbonation or the fizz is one of the most characteristic feature of any beer with which any beer lover can relate to. They always relate the word beer with the bubbles ascending seen through a glass of beer and forming to become a head. But carbonation has something more to it than just this image. It can alter the aroma of the beer and also the mouthfeel and even the flavor of the beer. You should understand that different beer styles are carbonated to different levels. Some English ales have very low carbonation levels that some need not even need priming at all, but at the same time, most European lagers have high carbonation levels. The German beer law of 1516 has strict laws on bottle priming and conditioning. It states that we can label a beverage as a beer only if it is primed and conditioned with forced CO2 or DME. So this video, according to the German beer law, is already breaking the law. Priming is a term used by brewers to add a fixed amount of sugar to your beer once it has completed fermenting. One of the mistakes beginners make is to bottle and prime before the fermentation is complete. The wort will have unfermented sugars in it if it has not been completed fermentation. If we add priming sugar into this wort and close it in a sealed beer bottle, it can lead to a disaster. Palmer, in his classic book, says that a homebrew is ready to bottle in 2 to 3 weeks when fermentation has finished completely. If the beer is bottled and primed before its fermentation is complete, the beer will become overcarbonated and the pressure may exceed and the bottle can burst. So either wait for 2 to 3 weeks for fermentation to complete or use a refractometer or a hydrometer to check its specific gravity. If it remains same for 2 consecutive days, then you can prime. Let's look at priming. The term priming is the addition of sugar, which can be done either directly into your bottle or your keg. This addition of sugar after completion of fermentation will kick in a small secondary fermentation which produces CO2 and also some alcohol. The CO2 produced will dissolve into the beer itself because it cannot escape from the closed bottle or your keg, which eventually produces the fizz or the carbonation bubbles. Let's look at conditioning. Conditioning is a term used when you store the fermented beer either in a bottle or a keg or a cask or a tank for a required period of time so that it will be carbonated and mature and bring out its beer flavor. But if I am in a hurry, I personally prefer kegging and forced carbonation instead of bottling, which takes only about 10 minutes for me and is simple and convenient. Bottling 5 gallons of beer needs multiple bottles and may take more than an hour to complete the filling. I prefer to bottle some styles of beer, especially if I brew a Trappist clone beer for which bottle conditioning is actually a requirement. I also prefer to bottle beers which I plan to store for a longer time. I feel that when bottle conditioned, the yeast in the bottle will scavenge any oxygen left in the headspace. I also find the carbonation bubbles to be of finer texture when bottle conditioned, but this is debatable. Before going into more details, let us get our terminology right. Natural carbonation is carbonation and conditioning using sugar, and artificial carbonation is carbonation and conditioning using CO2 cylinder. It is believed by some that artificial carbonation with CO2 cylinder produced inferior quality fizz or bubbles with larger bubbles than naturally carbonated beer with sugar, which produce finer bubbles. But at the same time, it can be argued that CO2 is CO2, whether made from a yeast cell or from a CO2 tank. One advantage of unfiltered beer conditioned in bottles is that there is live yeast present in it. This yeast will scavenge off any oxygen that would have been picked up during bottle transfer. The yeast would use up this oxygen before it can produce any off flavors of any oxidized beer. It is also said that naturally carbonated beer in bottles with sugar will taste different from artificially carbonated beer. This is because the sugar used will start another round of fermentation by the yeast, which will produce many byproducts in the closed confines of the bottle and remain within the bottle during the maturation stage, which will come out as a different flavor when compared with similar bottles carbonated artificially. It is said that when a naturally carbonated beer is poured into a glass, there will be more bubbles and foam because of more micronucleation sites, which will not be present in large numbers in an artificially carbonated beer. This is because naturally carbonated beers are not filtered. Filtration removes yeast and other microparticles which remain suspended in the beer. These microparticles, when present, will become micronucleation sites for CO2, and thus we get more finer bubbles in non-filtered naturally carbonated beer than filtered artificially carbonated beers. Let's have a look at the different types of priming sugars we use for carbonating and conditioning of a beer. Priming sugar is sugar added to your beer for carbonating it. For that matter, any type of fermentable sugar can be added, but keep in mind that some sugars will have desirable properties than others. These sugars will accentuate their particular flavor and aroma to the beer into which they are put. Let us look at corn sugar because it's the most commonly used. Corn sugar does not produce any flavor or aroma to your beer and is easily fermentable by the yeast. Any brewer should know that corn sugar is dextrose monohydrate. This means a single water molecule is attached to each sugar molecule, which means it is 90% water by mass. Another commonly used sugar is table sugar. Table sugar or cane sugar is less oftenly used than corn sugar. Table sugar sucrose is 100% fermentable. But it's said that table sugar imparts a cittery flavor to beer. But brewers who use this regularly tell that it is impossible to discern this cittery taste. And there are die-hard home brewers who are willing to swear on table sugar. Now let us look at DME or dry malt extract. The beer law of 1516 of Germany has strict laws on bottle priming and conditioning. It states that we can label a beverage as a beer only if it is primed and conditioned with forced CO2 or DME. DME is only 75% fermentable, unlike corn sugar or cane sugar, which is 100% fermentable. So, you should use 30 to 40% more DME by weight than corn sugar to achieve similar carbonation using DME alone. A problem with DME is that it will cause a fermentation ring in the neck of your bottle. This is not a concern if you are drinking it yourself, but if you distribute it among your friends, you have to tell each of them that the ring is harmless. This is because deposits on the inside of a beer bottle makes drinkers suspicious. Honey is often used in some beers and imparts its own floral and honey aroma. Although the flavor of honey may not be discernible in the end, it is up to 95% fermentable. It is not done regularly due to the cost of honey. Due to the high moisture content, you may need to use 50 to 20% more honey than you would use corn sugar. Now let's go to the basic principles in bottle priming and conditioning. These principles does not matter much if you are going to enjoy your drink yourself. But if you are going for a competition, then the exact carbonation requirement for the particular beer style matters a lot. But certainly, following these principles will make you a better brewer in all ways. There are a few basic principles you should follow when adding priming sugar. Allow fermentation to complete fully before adding priming sugar. Do not depend on airlock activity all the time. If you take a reading after fermentation due to lack of activity in your airlock and it has changed from the previous day, your beer is still fermenting and should not be bottled. This means that the sugars in the wort has not completely been fermented. Adding priming sugar into this partially fermented beer and sealing it inside a beer bottle is dangerous. This is extremely important as bottling beer that is still fermenting can lead to bottle bombs. So always make sure to have 2 successive days of reading showing stable specific gravity in your refractometer or hydrometer. The second principle is to measure sugar by weight and not by volume. Corn flour is like snow. It can be compressed up to 30% in volume. So if you take corn sugar from a pressure-packed container, you can take up to 30% more sugar than necessary. The practice of taking 3/4 cup for a gallon of beer can at times result in wrong carbonation levels due to this. More sugar can, as I said, result in a bottle bomb. This is why I say always measure your sugar by weight and not by volume. The third principle is not to cold crash your beer before bottling. One practice done by many homebrewers is to cold crash your beer once fermentation is complete. This is done with the intention of clarifying your beer as Brownian moment reduces when temperature reduces, and thus haze particles will settle to the bottom, thus clarifying your beer. Do not cold crash your beer as this will cause the remaining yeast in your fermenter to fall out of suspension into the bottom of the fermenter, and there will be very little yeast in suspension to eat up the priming sugar when you transfer the beer to the bottle to carbonate it, and your beer may taste flat when you serve it. I keep the beer in fermentation temperature and transfer it either into a keg or bottle and leave it for 1 to 2 weeks at the same fermentation temperature after the priming sugar is added. Thus, the yeast will still be present in your bottle or keg, and the second fermentation will start for priming and conditioning of your beer. Give good headspace in your beer bottle. Too much headspace and your beer may not carbonate well, and too little headspace means it may overcarbonate or even burst. The bottle in the right side has nil headspace at all. This is not ideal and the bottle may burst. This bottle has almost 1 inch of headspace and it's ideal. Even you can go up to 1.5 inches and you won't go wrong, but more than 2 inches I would not advise. Bottle conditioning refers to a method of adding fermenting wort or sugar solution into beer in its final package. It's important again that after you have added your priming sugar, never store them in serving temperature. That means 2 to 10 degrees Celsius. Store them only in the fermentation temperature. So, if you have fermented an ale at 15 degrees Celsius, condition them at 15 degrees. If you had fermented a larger at 10 degrees, prime and condition them at 10 degrees itself. Bottle conditioning, when done properly, can result in a beer with a finer, silkier texture of carbonation, superior foam retention, more complex flavors, longer shelf life, and better aging ability than beers that are force carbonated using CO2 tanks. The conditioning process allows time for a secondary fermentation. Here the yeast starts to use the byproducts of the primary fermentation as a food source. Examples of such byproducts include ketones that have buttery and honey-like flavors. These compounds are considered flaws when present in large amounts in beer and can cause stability problems during storage, leading to off flavors. Acetaldehyde is an example of a primary fermentation byproduct that has a pronounced green apple smell and taste. It's an intermediate compound in the production of ethanol and is harmful. The yeast reduces compounds such as these during the secondary fermentation process, making the beer safer. Towards the end of the secondary fermentation, the suspended yeast settles out and the beer starts to clear. This process can be helped by chilling the beer, very similar to what happens in the lagering process. In the case of ales, this process is referred to as cold conditioning and is a popular practice at most microbreweries for the production of craft beers. Condition for a minimum of 2 weeks and then keep them in serving temperature, that is anything between 2 to 10 degrees Celsius. Some people condition for 1 week and serve them.